Hello everybody and welcome to today's episode of Activist Lawyer. I am joined in the studio by Úna Boyd. Hi Úna.
Hi.
So it's fantastic to have you in person today, and just by way of introduction, Úna is the Immigration Solicitor at the Committee on the Administration of Justice, otherwise known as CAJ, am I right in saying?
Yeah, CAJ. Yeah.
An independent human rights organisation based in Belfast. Úna studied law at Queens University Belfast and has a Master's in Human Rights Law from the Irish Centre for Human Rights. Úna is an experienced immigration solicitor and former chair of the Law Society of Northern Ireland's Immigration Practitioners Group. Welcome, Úna.
Thanks so much.
So you and I know each other a little while now from our immigration days. Well, you're still involved in immigration. You were a practitioner before you started your role in CAJ. And before we get there, you might take us back in time a little bit. Why did you train to become a lawyer? What led you down that path?
So I've actually noticed a pattern on your podcast that so many people who come on here say, I actually never wanted to be a lawyer.
It's so true.
Yeah.
Did you not want to be a lawyer?
I'm
what
one
did
of
you
those
want
people.
To be?
I'm a marine biologist.
Okay.
I think
we haven't had that.
Yeah, I think like every little girl in the 90s, I was obsessed with dolphins. And Flipper, the film. So I decided I wanted to be a marine biologist. But then I discovered you have to be really good at maths and science, which I was not. I ended up studying law because I got the advice that, I didn't know what I wanted to do at university, and they said, if you do a law degree, you can really turn your hand to anything with it. So it was very practical. It was good advice, but it was very practical. And to be honest, I didn't really enjoy my law degree, and we work a lot with some of my former professors, so I really shouldn't say that, but I didn't really enjoy it until my final year. And at that time in Queen's, you were allowed to pick your modules for your final year, and I picked things that interested me. So I picked things like human rights law and gender in the law and international criminal law, and it was a real light bulb moment because I'd always been interested in human rights and sort of social justice issues, and I was the president of my school's like Amnesty International Society, like really, really cool kid. But I'd never made the connection that law was something that could lead to working in that. I don't know why, I just never made the connection until that final year. So following that, I did my Master's in International Human Rights Law down at the Irish Centre for Human Rights in Galway, which was just the most amazing experience. I can't recommend that enough if anyone's thinking of doing a Master's. It was just small school, absolutely amazing teachers, people from all over the world studying. It was amazing. And then through that, I was able to do an internship with Amnesty International.
Oh, wow.
And it was actually there was a lady who basically had my dream job, I realised. And I asked her, how did you get this job? Yeah. And she said how she had qualified as a barrister, but then her whole career had been in human rights in NGOs. And again, like I had never considered qualifying as a solicitor or barrister because my mum and dad are teachers. I don't have any connections to the law, and the reality here is if you don't have family, if you don't have a connection, it's so difficult to get training contracts. So I had kind of written that off. But then seeing her doing that role, I kind of thought, no, that really is what I'd want to do, so I'll give this a go. So then it was a bit of a long route. I ended up I was working as a receptionist in a law firm. I was working as a paralegal, and it took years before I sort of built a relationship with a firm and persuaded them to let me do a training contract. And then qualified as a solicitor. And in terms of immigration, I absolutely just fell into it because in the law firm that I was working as a paralegal in, they needed one paralegal to help with family, one paralegal to help with immigration, and they literally went, "Oh, you did human rights, you'll like the immigration stuff." And that's how it came about. But I loved it, and I mean, I remember, and one of the reasons I still love it was the idea it takes, you're studying all these human rights kind of concepts, and it can seem a bit sort of high in the sky and airy-fairy, but when I was doing immigration, I was suddenly using them for real people, and it was just that, I think that's what I fell in love with it.
You've really a very similar, it's like I'm just listening to you going, that's exactly the same route that I had, even the fact that I didn't like law until my final year as well with those subjects, and I'm sure lots of people listening will be in the same boat. But immigration, I mean, it's not easy, it's challenging, and I think there are challenges in working in immigration as a practitioner as well. it's a very niche area. I know people who dabbled in it and they ran away because it was just all-consuming. It's very difficult to do immigration with another area as well. I think it's very, very specific. How do you find practicing versus working in-house, I suppose, in your current role with CAJ?
Well, it's a huge difference because I don't do direct client work. CAJ only undertakes sort of strategic litigation. So really the only time that I'm dealing directly with clients is when we're working on a sort of a case that has a big public interest kind of slant, and it's a piece of strategic litigation, which is amazing because, you know, they're really impactful, meaningful cases. But it does mean you're not doing that daily kind of, you know, meeting people all the time and helping with applications, you know, appeals, all the sort of day-to-day work. What I miss about private practice is that feeling that you have directly impacted someone's life and helped, and, you know, someone would walk in the door and you almost feel like a detective or something. That's quite a lame way to put it, but you know, they come in with this complex, disastrous problem, and you can use the law and work out how to fix it for them, how to, you know, solve that. And it's just a really, really good feeling to be doing. And
it's very rewarding.
Yeah, it makes your work very fulfilling, very, very hard, but very fulfilling. So I do miss meeting people and that, you know, being able to help them day to day. But I think moving out of private practice came at a really good time for me because I'd been in it about 7 years, and I think I was getting a bit burnt out, you know, which so many immigration practitioners, you know, have experienced, and a lot of people we know have actually left.
I know,
completely. And it was, I think I remember saying to Brian, our previous director in CAJ, that I was really happy to move into kind of this strategic legal and policy role because I was really angry. And I was really frustrated, and I was sick of firefighting and seeing people treated wrong and their rights denied and poor decision making. And it felt like moving into CAJ meant I could take all that kind of frustration and anger and deal, you know, use it to affect change at the top, you know, instead of dealing with firefighting, you know, actually looking at the law, looking at the policy and trying to change that. So I think it was really good time to move into that. Really good
time. And that burnout is real, and we know so many people affected by it. And also the pressure around fees. And I mean, we know the legal aid system is absolutely abysmal, and that is one massive hurdle and one challenge that prevents both solicitors carrying out their duties in a way that's meaningful to their clients, and also clients themselves not able to access it for various, you know, it's just so restrictive. And we've talked about that a lot on the podcast. But just with the Committee on the Administration of Justice, CAJ, just tell us a little bit about the organisation and what its objectives are.
Yeah, so like you'd said, we're an independent human rights organisation based in Belfast. CAJ was founded back in the 80s, and it was instrumental in ensuring that human rights and equality were core to the peace agreement. So the role, as we see it now, is to look at those human rights and equality commitments and make sure they're actually, you know, happening and they're impacting everyone in the community in a meaningful way. We work across a really broad range of issues, but we have some sort of umbrella headings like democratic governance, policing injustice, legacy of the past, combating prejudice, promoting equality, and immigration.
Wow.
So I actually make sure
you do not have a single note in front of you.
I need to make if my boss is listening, hopefully I got all of them. But those are kind of the you know, the umbrellas that we try to bring our work in under, and then there's so many different things that myself and colleagues are working on under that, like Irish language rights or environmental rights or representing families of victims of the conflict. CAJ didn't do immigration as a sort of focus or specialism until they did a joint project with Ulster University and Queens University looking at the impact of Brexit on rights and equality in Northern Ireland. And you will not be surprised to hear the word immigration came up a lot, and they thought, right, we need actually in-house expertise on this because this is going to be a front line of human rights and equality going forward. And that was when I joined, so that was 2019. Immigration's now part of the core work for CAJ. You know, it's not going anywhere. And the purpose of the project, the immigration work, is that to achieve a human rights compliant immigration regime for Northern Ireland, which we haven't managed yet, but it means that it's really broad, and we can turn our hand to lots of different issues. And CAJ has been described as a think tank with teeth. So we do sort of high-level legal and policy work, and then strategic legal and policy interventions. So it's the same for the immigration work. So like I said, I don't do direct client work, but we do strategic litigation and a lot of sort of legal research, policy research and analysis.
Yeah, and we'll talk about some of the issues in more depth. But under that, just to make clear, it's not just immigration and work that would be impacting people who are here as in a migrant capacity for whatever reason, but also citizens' rights. So your work would directly affect anybody potentially living in Northern Ireland, regardless of their status, which is something that we will get to. So it kind of, I suppose there's a connection with immigration and all of the areas that you mentioned too. There's a real crossover there that we can see with CAJ's work. But just on immigration, things have blown up, haven't they? Well, there's always something. Like, let's just be honest. There's always an issue, and especially as you say, post-Brexit, immigration as a word kept coming up, and that's why obviously CAJ created that position. But what are the issues, I suppose, that are happening at the moment? And in my mind, I'm thinking Rwanda Scheme. The kind of that changes from week to week, and also just developments around it and its implementation. How is that playing a role in your work?
Yeah, I mean, when I started in 2019, I don't think anyone could have imagined just how rapidly we would see immigration law and policy in the UK just change, and unfortunately most of it regressive and not human rights compliant, and it's immigration's always been an area of law that changes really rapidly, but it's only increasing pace, like you said, and it's so difficult for people to keep on top of. But the Rwanda Act is probably the most recent one. So we've been doing we've done a lot of work on the different bits of legislation coming through: the National Line Borders Act, the Illegal Migration Act, the Rwanda Act. It's good timing to talk about the Rwanda Act because, was it yesterday? Rishi Sunak
the election
confirmed it. No one will be removed before the election.
It's just so sickening, though, that it's just used as a complete tool in all of this.
I mean, it was definitely geared and it was being ramped up because of the election. And then for, you see them say, well, actually, no one will be removed. It shows the reality.
Happen? Will it happen? Because how are they getting around it, even with, I know in part, but it was the UK Supreme Court.
Yeah.
They're looking at the ECHR all the time, but really it's,
it was a UK court. Yeah, I mean, so the Rwanda Act, I suppose, just for anyone who's not an immigration lawyer, because me and Sarah are just going to lean into this.
You should explain it.
Well, it's an outward. The UK government has been passing legislation to essentially remove the right to claim asylum in the UK, and as part of that, anyone who is declared inadmissible, as they call it, who doesn't get to claim asylum, there's a duty to remove them from the UK. So Rwanda is an outworking of that, where they need somewhere to remove them to. The idea would be that if you're declared inadmissible, you don't get to claim asylum in the UK, you get removed to Rwanda, and you have an asylum claim process there. This doesn't give you any rights in the UK. Like, it's not, you can never return. It basically means your asylum claim is in Rwanda. And the UK Supreme Court, as you said, found this to be unlawful back in 2023, and it was for a huge range of reasons. They went to pains to make sure it wasn't just the European Convention of Human Rights, because that would usually bring up so much rhetoric about, it's because of the ECHR. The court went to a lot of effort to set out all the different laws, all the different international obligations, and the real core thing was that they didn't think people would get their asylum claims processed properly in Rwanda, so therefore there was a risk they'd be returned to countries where they weren't safe. So they said Rwanda's not a safe country. And the UK government's response to that was to cobble together a piece of legislation, the Rwanda Act, to say, no, it is a safe country. We say it is. And even if you're not an immigration lawyer, I think that's something to really take a look at, because the idea of Parliament legislating to overturn the judgment of a court is huge, quite scary. We came in, it's actually a good example of kind of how we work in CAJ, because we we work across the UK and the island of Ireland, but we always try to, immigration is UK-wide policy, it's one size fits all, but we always try to focus in on how things will impact Northern Ireland and the unique kind of impacts here, and then feed those into the kind of UK-wide campaigns and responses. And the Rwanda Act's a really good example, because one of the things it does is it disapplies sections of the Human Rights Act, and it means ministers can ignore interim measures of the European Court of Human Rights. It literally says on the face of it that the UK government can't confirm it complies with the European Convention of Human Rights, which should be much more scandalous, but it's this, I think there's a few pieces of legislation now they've just said we can't confirm this complies with the ECHR. So that's bad enough all on its own, but when you look at Northern Ireland, then that potentially breaches the Good Friday Agreement.
Exactly.
So we were doing a lot of work on the Rwanda Act, and what's really frustrating, as you say, is what you can't emphasise enough is the damage, that whether this happens or not, between the election and legal challenges, it is hard to see how it could, and also it's so unworkable. It's hard to see whether this will actually happen.
Yeah.
But that's not what people on the ground hear, and the people are terrified of this.
Yeah.
And even people with status, people who have refugee status, even people with other types of immigration status, the misinformation and the toxic kind of language around it is so strong that, you know, so many people are terrified of being removed to Rwanda.
And I suppose just as a consequence, well, just to mention, the Irish High Court itself had said that to return someone to Britain would essentially, they would declare it an unsafe country, which was big news. Now, I know there's lots of talk since that of reversing that and trying to get over that, because of what we're witnessing around election time, both in the UK and in Ireland. And we have picked up on, and you can't ignore it, an anti-migrant rhetoric across this island and in the UK. You've mentioned there that people feel, you know, terrified and are living in fear because of, you know, talk around a scheme like the Rwanda scheme. But in general, what have you noticed, or your organisation, in terms of this kind of quite damaging language? They're talking about numbers. We know in the UK the campaign of Stop the Boats is used day in, day out, but it's happening here as well, and in Ireland. You know, how damaging is this, and is it something that we should be concerned about?
Yeah, I think it's been really disappointing to see the upswing in sort of anti-migrant rhetoric, particularly in the Republic of Ireland. Like I said, we work across the UK and Ireland, and previously I would have been in meetings with organisations, you know, from England, Scotland, and I would have been saying, well, the good thing is we're in a unique position because immigration is not a vote winner. It isn't used as a scapegoat. It isn't relied on by our politicians, you know. So we have we can have much more sensible conversations about immigration. We can, you know, engage with our politicians and policymakers, and we can rely on facts, and we can, you know, it was a very different situation to what organisations were facing, particularly in England. And it's been, frustrating to see that slowly change. And I mean, it's particularly when you have political parties. So if you have sort of what appears to be anti-migrant kind of anti-migrant movements or feeling on the ground, that's concerning enough. And what you need is a government that looks at that, looks at what's causing it, and tries to address it and stop it. But instead, it feels like we have governments in the UK and now in Ireland as well that almost provide political cover for these kind of really toxic, quite aggressive anti-migrant campaigns. I mean, recently we had the Justice Minister made this sweeping statement about how many people were claiming asylum after crossing the land border. And the headline was, you know, you can see how this feeds into this really toxic rhetoric. What was it, like over 80%?
80%, yeah.
And then when you actually looked at the figures, there was no evidence.
No evidence.
And in fact, the only reputable piece of research around this, which came from the Economic and Social Research Institute, sorry, I always get their acronym wrong, it had looked at that in a report in 2022 and said that what the minister was relying on, that kind of, if they claim at this IPO, was completely unreliable. This had already been looked at.
But the damage is done, and even if you search that, you'll see it. You'll still see that as the main headlines in all of the leading media. And just moving on a little bit to Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland High Court's determination in a recent matter whereby it ruled that certain provisions of the Illegal Migration Act 2023 are incompatible with the European Convention on Human Rights. So we'll talk a little bit more about the European Convention on Human Rights and how your work has been impacted, or how you've been working on that. But how was this news received, and how important was this judgment?
Its judgment was really, really significant, and we have to give the shout out to the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission and Sinead from Phoenix Law, who took the two cases, because it was absolutely groundbreaking legal work, and it has been so welcomed by everyone that works with refugees, with asylum seekers and beyond. Anyone that works or cares about sort of the protection of rights in Northern Ireland has been so happy to see this judgment. And to be honest, particularly for immigration practitioners, it might be the first bit of good news people have had in a long time. And that's not just in Northern Ireland. The response we've had from the rest of the UK has just been so overwhelming and so positive, and we can be really proud, actually, I think, of the work that's being done here. And what's really interesting about it is that this used unique tools and unique protections that we have here in Northern Ireland to hold the line on rights, and I think it's just absolutely brilliant to see. So the part of the judgment ruled that sections of the Illegal Migration Act are incompatible with the European Convention on Human Rights, which is really significant on its own. There should be a declaration of incompatibility, and organisations across the UK can rely on that and use it in their work. But perhaps even more significant, we saw them use Article 2 of the Windsor Framework, formerly the NI Protocol, in this case. And what Article 2 does, it's a post-Brexit, part of the post-Brexit agreements, and it commits the UK government to no diminution of rights that are found in the Good Friday Agreement as a result of Brexit. And so that's a really significant commitment, and it was part of that sort of Brexit negotiation and the concern about how it might impact Northern Ireland, might impact the Good Friday Agreement, and that's a UK government commitment. So what that means is, in this case, they have found that parts of the Illegal Migration Act do represent a diminution of the rights protected under the Good Friday Agreement, and because they previously would have been protected by EU law directives, such as the Trafficking Directive, it is as a result of Brexit. So the outworking of that isn't just, it's a declaration of incompatibility. It disapplies the law in Northern Ireland.
But how would that work, given that Rishi Sunak's not the first Conservative Prime Minister to want to get rid of the ECHR and in turn, I suppose, the Human Rights Act, and you've heard them say they want to rip it up for all sorts of reasons. His is centred around immigration. As we know, he bases it on non-refoulement and the whole Rwanda scheme. But we did have Theresa May beforehand, and David Cameron had said the same thing, right? And they say that using their own, I think hers was around prisoner voting rights or whatever it might have been at the time. But the danger around this is so, they don't think about the consequences that this will have. Well, it's not that they don't think about it, but the public don't know, let's say, about the consequences that this might have on all of our fundamental rights if they were to opt out of the ECHR. Now, you mentioned there, how it was interpreted in that judgment as well. But for Northern Ireland, it would have a significant impact because of the Good Friday Agreement, but not just that, because Article 2 of the ECHR now has been heavily relied on in inquests here, legacy work, and it impacts all of our lives, private life, all of that. How worried are you about the government's apparent determination to opt out of the ECHR and, of course, shred? I suppose the Human Rights Act would be non-functioning then as a result.
Yeah, we're a human rights organisation, so really, really this is a massive concern. And so we were heavily involved in the campaign against the Bill of Rights. Bill of Rights Act, I think was the full title, but it was essentially the No Bill of Rights, which it would have scrapped the Human Rights Act and replaced it with a sort of British Bill of Rights, but it represented a massive regression in terms of rights protections. So we were heavily involved in the Save Our Human Rights Act campaign around that, and it was great that that has now been scrapped. You know, that bill is not going forward. But that wasn't because anyone sort of came to their senses. It was because it was Dominic Raab's pet project.
That's right.
So once he
left,
fell out of favour, it fell out of favour. But what's perhaps scarier is what we have seen is some of the worst parts of that bill. We're now seeing them sort of snuck in to discrete pieces of legislation, and it seems to be forming this pattern where it's piecemeal dismantling the Human Rights Act and disapplying the ECHRs to the point that it seems like the intention is to leave it, you know, meaningless and without teeth. So immigration's been a really key example of this. Like I'd mentioned, the Rwanda Act, on the face of the bill, they say we can't confirm this is compliant with the ECHR. It allows ministers to ignore interim measures of the European Court of Human Rights. It removes the Human Rights Act provisions that require courts to interpret law in compliance with the ECHR, public bodies to interpret and make decisions in compliance with the ECHR. So all of these things are really, they're making it meaningless. And what's scary in that as well is that, you know, these will impact, that was concerning Rwanda. And the Legal Migration Act concerned people claiming asylum, people who might be detained under immigration grounds. So it's I think they also used it in a prisoners bill. So it's targeting specific groups, and there seems to be an intentionality that these are maybe groups people won't notice or won't care about, or that's how they think about it. But it completely undermines the universality of human rights. If you have certain people can rely on the ECHR, certain people can't, you know. And as you said, this is a really specific concern in Northern Ireland because they constantly seem to forget, or as you say, don't care, that the Good Friday Agreement it baked in the ECHR, and it required the UK government to bring the ECHR into domestic law, and that's how we got the Human Rights Act. And it requires the UK government to allow direct access to the courts and remedies. So, you know, it's not soft. It's a really clear, strong commitment, and all of these piecemeal kind of regressions seem like a real risk of breaching the Good Friday Agreement.
It has a knock-on effect. It would totally violate the peace process, essentially, if that were to happen. And then, obviously, you'd mentioned Article 2 of the Windsor Framework is what that would be impacted by it, although well, it would be at odds with it, but that's a strong reading of the article, you know, the protections for citizens here. So that's a good, how can people rely on that, or is that something,
no, Article 2 is a relatively new thing because it came out of, you know, the post-Brexit, the NI Protocol, the Windsor Framework. So it's almost a new frontier of law, and what we've seen this year is we've had a few pieces of litigation that have really rounded out Article 2. We now know how the courts interpret it, how it applies. Like, one of the key things was the scope of it, and now they've confirmed that the wording is everyone in the community, so that includes asylum seekers. It is the clear reading of that. So it's pretty exciting, actually, you know, especially for legal geeks to see the development of this, and for anyone who's thinking, well, how is that relevant to my work, or how is that relevant to me as a person? Like, Article 2 of the Windsor Framework, again, it protects against no diminution of rights, and it's enforceable. You know, this is it's overseen by dedicated mechanisms, as they're called, in the Human Rights Commission and the Equality Commission. And if you feel like perhaps if you think to yourself, this is a right I used to have, I don't have it anymore because of Brexit, I'd love to know whether this is something I can challenge. You can contact the dedicated mechanism teams, and in fact, people might have seen the Equality Commission did adverts that said, you know, protect your rights after Brexit, contact us. Part of the Windsor Framework protects and keeps pace with EU directives that protect equality, and that's another route that people can use to protect their rights. And it's so broad. I think the Commission, for example, has done work on guide dogs, because the post-Brexit kind of arrangements would have limited people's access to guide dogs, and they were able to use these protections. And I don't think that had to be litigated on, but I think they were able to use those to say to the UK government, no, you have to do something to make sure people can access guide dogs. So people shouldn't underestimate what it can impact.
It. So that's really significant. And of course, as with anybody listening, you can contact the dedicated mechanism.
In the Equality Commission and the Human Rights Commission. That's
brilliant. And just on that as well, post-Brexit, you're talking about that. It impacted our work massively. And I suppose it created kind of various classes of citizenship with differing rights within Northern Ireland. It kind of emphasised the hostile environment. I think I'm right in saying that, in that, you know, when we think about the hostile environment, if people don't really know, I suppose it's expressly aimed to make lives of individuals with irregular immigration status more difficult and unbearable at times through various measures, and they place duties on policing and other institutes to kind of monitor immigration but more have been affected by that since Brexit. So coupled with that, and then of course how Brexit impacted the common travel area, how free movement and free movement rights for people living in Northern Ireland has been impacted. You've done a lot of work on that before you joined CTA and of course during your role there. How has the organisation been at the fore on some of the most pertinent issues, and what are we seeing here in terms of issues that are affecting the common travel area and people living either side of it? Because of course it applies across the UK and Ireland, doesn't it? And it was there, I suppose, to prevent a hard border and to protect the peace process. What has been coming up of late? There's always going to be something, but what have you been noticing as a more widespread issue?
Yeah, so on the first point about Brexit and the hostile environment, absolutely. I mean, even just the most obvious example is EU citizens were suddenly subject to normal UK immigration law and policy, which is completely under the umbrella of the hostile environment. So that was a huge shock to a lot of people. We have a really interesting piece of work on the hostile environment where we've been looking at whether devolved powers can be used to push back on some of it, because what we found with the hostile environment is it applies to, as you say, every piece of everyday life. But it means that it encroaches on so many areas that are actually devolved competencies, you know, and our argument is, well, can Stormont say, well, no, that doesn't reflect our society here, it doesn't reflect the commitments of a rights-based society of the Good Friday Agreement, we are going to say no to it. And we've got a piece of research on that kind of mapped it out, and some of it's so simple, but like, you know, you can lose your driving licence if you lose your status. And I mean, you would have seen with clients what a horrendous impact that can have in people's lives. No surprise, driving licences are devolved. There's absolutely no reason that we have to do that. And the basic argument is that just because something is happening to a person who's a migrant does not make it immigration, because of course immigration is an accepted matter. So that's a really interesting piece of work, and if anyone's interested in it, please get in touch with me, because we're really trying to encourage practitioners to kind of look at that and look at areas where they could push back through using devolved powers. On the common travel area, it's a big focus of our work, and we have a joint campaign with Northwest Migrant Forum, who are a brilliant migrant-led organisation based in Derry, so of course very close to the border, and they really feel and see the impacts of the common travel area. So I mean, for anyone who doesn't know, the common travel area, it's an administrative arrangement that allows free check-free travel between the UK and Ireland. It's not a visa-free zone. Everyone still has to have the visas that are required, but you should be able to travel within this without being checked. After Brexit, as you say, nobody knew about it before that except immigration lawyers, because it was always affecting our clients. But after Brexit, it became a real kind of go-to, and there was this talk suddenly of common travel area rights, but with this kind of misinformation that they only apply to British and Irish citizens. And unfortunately, that kind of language has really taken away from its importance simply as a free travel zone. So we have a campaign, as I said, and we focused in on some areas where looking at how the common travel area works in reality and how it impacts people. So one area is racial profiling in the common travel area, where both between east-west, between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, and also north-south, between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and we have evidence of fairly blatant racial profiling on all of those routes. It's particularly, at the moment, we're particularly focused on the north-south route, because the Garda, the way the legislation is written, the Garda have the power to check anyone who is not British or Irish or European when they are travelling over the land border.
But is this on public transport?
Yeah. And the instant question there is just, well, how do they get onto a bus and they know who's not British or Irish? It's, it's racial profiling written into legislation.
100%.
So we think that legislation needs sort of completely reformed to prevent racial profiling and discriminatory practices. And with the rhetoric at the moment around the land border and people crossing it to claim asylum, we're really concerned we're only going to see that ramped up instead of actually reformed and, made human rights compliant. We also have a piece of work on the impact of visa requirements on people who live on the island of Ireland. So a visa national is someone who has to get a visa to enter the UK or Ireland, even as a visitor. And this leads to this bizarre situation where people who are legally resident in Northern Ireland or the Republic of Ireland who are visa nationals, they have to apply for, pay for and get a visa to cross the border. Even for an hour, even for a minute.
I don't think people get this, and especially
No.
when we were in discussions around when the Home Office were introducing the EU settlement scheme, and you were speaking to their policy team, or nobody understood what it was like to live on the border, the day-to-day living arrangements that impacted people leaving their children to school, shopping, getting petrol, all of this. And some people just find it really difficult to believe that aren't from here, that this is still the case.
Yeah.
And what's the story then with the ETA? Wasn't there talk about introducing the electronic travel authorisation?
Yeah.
How's that going?
Well, yeah. So, it's bad enough that we have visa nationals who can't, like Northwest Migrant Forum's example they often refer to is there are people living in Derry who are on work visas, who have their refugee status, living perfectly legally, but because they're a visa national, they would need an Irish tourist visa to visit their nearest beach, which is 15 minutes away.
Or
in
to go
Donegal.
to Dublin Airport, essentially.
Yeah.
That's what people don't realise. They think you could fly out of Dublin and that's more cost effective to go. But no, they essentially require to apply for a visa.
I mean, we're in Newry right now. If you're in Newry, if you're in Derry, you wouldn't even know when you cross the border. And very often things that you need to access, the nearest one is across the border. So it creates this really horrific situation for visa nationals where they're basically iced out of that cross-border life the rest of us live. And then they brought in, and again, when we're talking about the common traveller, we need to see this reformed, we need to see it modernised, you need these things. There's a really easy solution to that we've been campaigning on, which is that many people already have, non-visa nationals have deemed leave, which means they don't have to apply in advance for a visa if they're visiting the UK or Ireland. They could apply that to people living on the island of Ireland.
Exactly, as opposed to just certain people from certain countries.
Exactly. So if you're legally resident in Northern Ireland, you should be allowed deemed leave if you're visiting the Republic of Ireland. It's very straightforward. Shouldn't be controversial. So that's our ask on that. But instead of seeing this sort of modernised and reformed, we've seen things like electronic travel authorisation, which
ridiculous.
Great idea if you're talking about flying from Paris to London. It was this idea that you have to have pre-clearance. A lot of us would have gone through similar to travel to America with the ESTA. Very similar system. Fair enough, it's light touch, you apply in advance. It's not a visa, it's a pre-clearance check. But they completely forgot how that would work on the border. And it took a lot of interventions throughout the legislation being developed. We had amendments going through, we had parliamentary questions, and we couldn't get it amended when the legislation was being passed. Even though we were saying, look, this will not work on the land border, it would have required somebody living in the Republic of Ireland, an EU citizen, for example, if they wanted to travel from Dublin to Newry, would have had to apply for electronic travel authorisation, pay the money, have that in advance. It was just totally unrealistic. So the good news about that was this is actually a bit of a win for us, which it's always good to have the good news. After a lot of work, a lot of campaigning, we managed to get a lot of sort of political interest. The Irish government really stepped up. They came out and spoke about concerns about this. The tourist industry came out and really got behind this, saying it would really impact them. And after all of that, we did get very quietly through secondary legislation, they did amend it. And the result of that is that people who are legally resident in the Republic of Ireland do not have to get electronic travel authorisation if they're travelling within the common travel area. So that's really positive for people living in the south. The one thing that's missing though is it doesn't apply to visitors, so it doesn't apply to tourists. So now you have all these people who are non-visa nationals who previously would have been able to travel around the island of Ireland without any issue, or within the common travel area like Ireland and the UK, no issues, no visas required as visitors. They now have to get electronic travel. Tourists. So if you're not,
doesn't matter where they're from.
If you don't need a visa, then the likelihood is you're going to need electronic travel authorization. And you can imagine, a tour bus full of American tourists who want to go to the Giant's Causeway for a day, asking them all to pay this money and apply for this. It's a huge barrier. So although it's been a huge win for residents of the Republic of Ireland, they're exempt from it. There's still a campaign particularly by the tourist bodies about that.
Sure, which makes sense and what about residents here then?
Well, because if you're a resident in the UK, you would have already had either status or the right to live here. You don't have to get electronic travel authorization.
But to go to Ireland?
So Ireland aren't going to introduce anything similar. There was a lot of confusion at one point because Europe is, Schengen area is bringing in a similar pre-clearance system, but Ireland's outside of Schengen, and they haven't, from what we've heard, they don't have any plans to bring anything similar in at the moment.
But that's a big win, massive progress on that, which just shows, gosh, immigration, it's mind-blowing. But it's also, as we spoke about earlier, it feeds into the whole concept of citizens' rights on the island as a whole. It's not just impacting people who've moved here from somewhere else and are legal residents on the island. Just moving on, back to your work, and anybody who's listening in will find, your work it's strategic in the sense that it's very different from what you've done before in terms of the practice, and we spoke about that. What advice would you have for somebody who, listened to your career journey and wanted to really work in a similar space to you? What would you advise them to do, and would you recommend it?
I will say I absolutely love what I do, and I loved private practice as well. It's really challenging. But I really do. I can't stress enough how fulfilling and rewarding this type of work is. And I really do enjoy the work I'm in now. It's fascinating. No day is the same, and you do feel like you're really making a difference. And I guess for anyone who's interested in this kind of field, I hope from what I'd said earlier, it's obvious I took quite a long and roundabout route, to where I am. I'm very lucky and very privileged to be in the job I'm in now, but, it certainly wasn't something where I graduated and went, I want to do this, and went straight into it. And I do meet a lot of people kind of just starting out in their career who feel really dejected that they want to do a specific type of work and they can't quite get into it. But so I guess my advice would be not to worry, follow your feet, take your time, suck every job dry for the skills it can give you, even if it doesn't seem that relevant, because they nearly always are.
Good advice,
and keep one foot in the thing that interests you, if that's volunteering or just even taking part in events or trying to bring it into your work in whatever way you can, because, you'd be amazed even just by kind of keeping in touch and keeping linked in with the thing that you're passionate about. You'll meet people, you'll make connections, and that's very often where you'll end up finding a role. The other piece of advice that I've started to give people is to ignore everyone that laughs at you when you say you want to do, say, human rights and equality work or any specific kind of area, because I really have found in my experience there's still a bit of an old-fashioned view of law and legal practice, particularly in Northern Ireland. And you do get people who will really dismiss the idea that you can do something like human rights work. I had a recruitment agent who will remain nameless tell me that I would never work. When I was a newly qualified solicitor, he told me I would not work in Northern Ireland and to call him back when I got experience in something useful like conveyancing or family law. So I'm really glad I didn't listen to him. I was also at an event fairly recently. It was a careers event, and a corporate lawyer in the room told a room full of students that they got into law because they wanted to do human rights, they wanted to work for Amnesty International, but then they grew up and got real. It was a bit awkward that I went after her, but you do find this, I suppose what I would say is I know how dispiriting I found that, and absolutely ignore it. What you can do with law now, what you can do as a lawyer is it's just there's so much scope. There's so many fascinating different types of work you can do, So don't let people put you off because they see it as, oh, it has to be this sort of 9 to 5 specific type of work in an office, and you know there's only like 5 fields and that's it. Don't listen to them.
Excellent, really, and that is advice worth taking heed of, because you might encounter that. Even like I remember encountering that where there was maybe 2 of us sitting in the optional modules for human rights or immigration in the Law Society. I was like, where's everybody gone? You're really isolated.
They cancelled the immigration module when I was at the institute because not enough people signed up.
We'll see. That's an example where you might feel a little bit lonely and isolated, but as Una said, push on and keep going.
There's lots of us.
Yeah, there are. We stick together. But and finally, how important do you think activism is and the law? We ask a lot of our guests this question, and I suppose it makes sense given the context of your work. But how important is it for the two to work together to make change, or is it important?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be biased on this. My mum likes to say that I do hippie law, which I think is positive. I think she means, you know, I got into law to help people and make change rather than, you know, make tons of money or have a corner office. But so that was always kind of how I viewed law. Like I said, I wasn't even really particularly interested in it until I saw that it could be this route to, you know, impacting change and helping people. I'd like to see law recognised as a powerful tool in the kind of concept of activism. I think too often there's a bit of a disconnect between, you know, legal practitioners and lawyers and the campaigns and the kind of activism and community work on the ground. And very often when you have people who aren't from a legal background as well, they can be quite disenfranchised, or they might have quite a negative experience of the law. So they don't feel comfortable using or accessing the law as this tool. But really you can affect so much change when you bring all of that together. And this was a bit of a learning curve for me, and the case that really showed me it was actually D'Souza, because like I was the solicitor in that, and I was blinkered. I was like, we need to win this in court. This is this is a legal matter. This is a court case. And in the end, we didn't win in court. And it's actually easy to forget that because it did achieve such big change for people. But the reason that was successful was not because of the court case. It was because Jake and Emma D'Souza took that case and they got so many people interested and involved. You know, you had lawyers, you had journalists, you had politicians, you had artists, you had so many people, you know, actively working on and campaigning on the issue. And the legal case was just one small part of it. So it meant it really it had a life outside of the court. And that's what achieved the change there. And that was like a really big lesson for me. And I think, I'd love to see the law recognised as that kind of positive, powerful tool. And for lawyers not to shy away from it. You know, you should be proud that you can bring that. That would be brilliant.
Well, Una, thank you so much for joining. That has been fantastic. Now, we could sit all day and talk about the various impacts of immigration on this island. But look, thank you for joining me in the studio today, and we look forward to following your work. And for anybody who is interested in the Committee on the Administration of Justice in Northern Ireland, you have a fantastic website at ECHR, so please check out Una's work and her colleagues. It's really impactful and very important.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks everyone for joining me today. If you like the show, please remember to share and leave a review if you have a moment. And you can also check out our website, www.activistlawyer.com, where you will see some blog articles written by our guests and contributors, as well as some fabulous Activist Lawyer merchandise.
This podcast was recorded in Granite Podcast Studio. Interested in starting up your own podcast but don't know how? Granite Podcast Studio can help. Record your podcast in our state-of-the-art studio, which is based in the heart of Newry City. Our studio has cutting-edge and user-friendly technology and can seat up to 4 people. We also provide an editing service, where our team using your guidance and editing notes to provide you with a flawless finished product, leaving your listeners wanting more. For more information on how you can get started, visit www.granitepodcaststudio.com.